When you think of gaming PCs, you probably think of large, full-size towers with big graphics cards and power supplies weighing as much as an old Alienware laptop. But wouldn't it be great if you could have a PC that was portable, lightweight, and easy to move, but also has the ability to play games at your home just by simply hooking up a graphics card? Well, today we are having a look at the MinisForum UN1250 mini PC. We will be pairing it with an eGPU and putting it to the test to see if it can handle some serious gaming. So here it is, the MinisForum UN1250. MinisForum did actually send this out for free, but I'm not required to do or say anything specifically. So if it sucks, I'll tell you. But honestly, having used this PC for the past few weeks, I feel like there's only really good things to say about it. On the outside of the box, we can see that this is the UN1250, which corresponds to the i5 1250p CPU inside. Onto the more interesting parts, inside the box, we have a few instruction manuals, including a paper about the CPU cooler, which actually uses liquid metal instead of your traditional thermal paste. We then have the PC, followed by the HDMI cable, a power brick, a mounting bracket, and a 2.5-inch drive adapter. On the front I/O, we have two USB 3.2 ports, a headphone audio jack, the power button, and a clear CMOS button, which you may have to use after you change your SSD or RAM. On the back, we have two USB 2.0 ports, a display port, 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, a HDMI port, a USB-C 3.2 port, and the power connector. This means you can connect up to 3 monitors using the HDMI, DisplayPort, and USB-C ports. On the sides and the bottom of the device, we have ventilation holes. Despite the case looking like metal, kind of like the Mac Mini, the casing is actually made from plastic, which definitely makes it feel a bit cheaper. But the price is also a lot cheaper than the Mac Mini or something similar. You can pick up the MinisForum UN1250 for less than $300, or less than £300 if you're in the UK. And that's the version with the 1TB SSD. If you opt for the 500GB SSD, it would be even cheaper. A cool feature, which I think is very useful, is being able to mount this PC behind a monitor or TV. You just take the included bracket, screw it onto your monitor, screw a couple screws onto the PC, and then you can easily put the PC on the back of the monitor and then take it off again. This allows for your desk and workspace to remain clear for very clean setups. Additionally, you could put this behind a TV if you want to use it as some kind of media server, or maybe to showcase a display. And according to them, you can leave this running 24/7, so it would be useful to quite a fair few people out there. Annoyingly, however, the power cable is a brick, and not enclosed in the device itself, so it will make it a bit challenging hiding that cable. Inside this PC, we have an Intel Core i5 1250p, which is basically a mobile laptop CPU, but it should get some good performance, whilst not consuming too much power. It then has 16GB of DDR4 3200MHz memory, which could be a bit faster as we now have DDR5, but for the price point it probably makes sense. For storage, we have a 1TB PCIe 4.0 NVMe SSD. Then we have the standard Intel Iris Xe integrated graphics. And finally, for I/O, we have one DisplayPort, one HDMI, and one USB-C. The PC measures in at approximately 128 by 128 by 50mm, so it is very compact and easy to carry. The SSD, RAM, and Wi-Fi card can all be changed very easily by taking the bottom off the PC and just swapping components out. Setup is super simple. You just connect your video cable, your power cable, keyboard and mouse, and then you're ready to go. Windows 11 comes pre-installed, so it's just plug and play. Now, the UN1250 is not a gaming PC, nor is it really marketed as a gaming PC, due to the fact that it does not have a dedicated GPU. That does not mean, however, it can't play games. Surprisingly enough, most games I can run with decent FPS at medium or low settings, depending on the game of course. In GTA 5, I was able to get 49.1 FPS on average at normal settings 1080p. The 1% and 0.1% lows were at 35.8 and 24 FPS respectively, so this was actually pretty decent and more than playable. I know GTA 5 is quite an old game now, and pretty much runs on every machine, but it's good to see that there wasn't too much stuttering going on. I've been playing GTA 5 with the More Threads MTT S70, which has good FPS, but actually stutters like crazy. So at least it's not like that. And also take a look at the temps of the CPU. It stays at around 60 degrees, which is great considering the whole of the PC is packed into that tight area. The liquid metal thermal paste is probably helping out there. Red Dead Redemption 2 at the lowest preset 1080p gave us 22.4 FPS on average, which is not great, but it's still playable if you don't mind the lower FPS. The game didn't stutter too much, which made it okay to play with a 1% low of 18.6 and a 0.1% low of 12.9 FPS. Going into the more busy areas in the game only decreased the FPS by a couple frames. But I guess when you only have about 20 FPS, losing a few frames makes the difference a lot more noticeable than if you have like 100 FPS and lost a few frames. It was a good effort by the mini PC, but realistically I think you need dedicated graphics to play this game, at least at 1080p anyway. If you turn down the resolution to like 720p, I'm sure it'd be a much smoother experience, but I imagine people aren't playing at 720p these days. Spiderman Remastered also only averaged in the 20s. It got 24 FPS on average, which is higher than Red Dead, but the 1% and 0.1% lows were at 12.2 and 5.3 FPS respectively, so this shows that there was a fair amount of stuttering. The game felt mostly playable, but I think a dedicated GPU would also be very useful here. Cyberpunk did actually run, although it was at the low preset. I turned off any resolution scaling stuff, so this is running at 1080p. Here we also only average in the 20s, with an average FPS of 21.3. Not ideal, but at least you can play it. The 1% and 0.1% lows were okay-ish, at 14.9 and 9.7 FPS respectively. If you turned on the resolution scaling, you would probably have a better experience, but even at 21 FPS, it wasn't that bad. Shadow of the Tomb Raider ran and then crashed at all the settings I tested it at, with a message about maybe not having enough resources. And that's definitely weird because I can usually run this game on just about anything, because it's not too demanding. But anyway, moving on. Resident Evil 3 ran pretty well, considering this is at medium settings 1080p. It got an average of 43.3 FPS with a 1% low of 27.9 and a 0.1% low of 26.2 FPS. So this was very playable at these settings, and you also had opportunities to turn up or down the settings, depending on whether you would favour extra FPS over quality. Onto some esports titles now. CS2 at low settings 1080p got 58 FPS on average. Whilst that does seem pretty good, I feel like a higher FPS is really needed in a game like Counter-Strike. It wasn't really ideal to play because there were occasional lag spikes, which just made it hard to play the game. Like you would be shooting at someone and it could just freeze up, making it super frustrating. Rainbow Six Siege at low settings 1080p gave us 65.2 FPS on average. This was very playable as there was not any stuttering, with the 1% low at 51.7 and 0.1% low at 46.9 FPS. So overall a very good experience in Rainbow Six Siege. Cinebench gave us a multi-core score of 8703 points for the i5-1250p, and that places it near the Ryzen 7 1700X and i9 9880H. 3D Mark TimeSpy gave us a score of 1523, which is not that good for gaming. We can see that the graphics score is just 1340, while the CPU score is at 6806. So the lack of dedicated graphics is definitely holding this PC back. Well, at least for gaming anyway. The UN1250 is pretty quiet when at idle, but at load it does become quite loud, to the point where it's noticeable, but it's not necessarily annoying. Here you can hear the sound of the fan next to the mic while 3D Mark is running. So in all the games, the CPU was definitely being held back by the GPU, or lack of GPU I should say. Therefore, in order to get more performance, we need to put in a graphics card. Obviously, being a mini PC, we can't just stick a graphics card in and start playing. We need to use an eGPU. There are a few ways of connecting an eGPU, but this PC does not have an Oculink port, and nor does it have Thunderbolt. We therefore are going to use an M.2 M-Key to PCIe adapter. This adapter uses the M.2 M-Key slot and converts it to a PCIe 4.0 x16 slot, although it will be running at X4 at the maximum because that's the maximum of the M.2 slot. In this mini PC, we have two M.2 slots. One is for the Wi-Fi card and one is for our SSD. We can't use the Wi-Fi card slot because it's an M.2 A&E key slot, which will most likely be too slow. So we will have to use the M-Key slot, which has our SSD in it. Luckily, this PC has a 2.5-inch SSD connector, and we can connect our SSD to boot off of that. So we will remove our NVMe SSD and plug in our slower SATA SSD. For this PC, we're going to be using an RTX 4060. There are a couple reasons for this, but the main one is that it only uses 120 watts of power. And this is very important because we're going to be powering this using a Dell 220 watt power brick. The 4060 should also pair quite nicely with the i5-1250p, as the i5 isn't the most powerful processor out there, so there shouldn't be too many bottlenecks. So we connect our graphics card to this adapter and we screw it in. The GPU power connectors connect from the board directly to the graphics card. And then normally you would plug a 24 pin and a CPU 4 pin in directly from your power supply. But in my case, I'm using the Dell power cable, which just helps it make it a cleaner setup. So we just get the 8 pin from that Dell cable, and that goes into this part here. Now we open up our MinisForum mini PC and plug our eGPU into the M.2 M key slot. We now connect everything back up and turn it on, making sure we connect the video cable to the graphics card. And now we have our RTX 4060 connected to our mini PC. All we need to do now is download the NVIDIA drivers and mini PC drivers. We can see here in GPU-C we have our RTX 4060 running with PCIe 4.0 X4. So now let's test some games again and see how much of an improvement we get. So in GTA 5 at normal settings, which are the exact same as before, we now get 134.8 FPS on average, and that's compared to our 49.1 without our RTX 4060. Our 1% and 0.1% lows have also increased massively to 96.4 and 80.9 FPS respectively. We can even turn up the settings to Ultra now with MSAA times 8. And here we were able to get 80.7 FPS on average, with a 1% low of 55.7 and a 0.1% low of 44.5 FPS. That's quite the improvement we get just from adding our dedicated GPU. Red Dead Redemption 2 originally got us 22.4 FPS on average. We now get a massive 126.6 FPS on average at low settings at 1080p. So of course we could turn the game up to the ultra settings, and that still gave us a very good 68.5 FPS on average. The 1% and 0.1% lows were also very good at 52.9 and 31.4 FPS respectively. We could definitely turn on some anti-aliasing here, but we would get a slightly lower FPS, but it's still playable nonetheless. In Spiderman Remastered, we have gone from 24 FPS to 159.5 FPS by adding our graphics card, and that's at low settings 1080p. Cranking up the settings to the very high preset, we still get 112.1 FPS on average. The 1% and 0.1% lows were a bit low at 66.7 and 47.8 FPS respectively, but this is still a massive improvement over playing with the integrated graphics. Cyberpunk is another game where we only averaged in the 20s before. Now we get 97.3 FPS at the same settings, which is a massive improvement. At ultra settings we were getting 77 FPS on average, and if we turned ray tracing on to the ray tracing medium preset, we were getting 62.4 FPS. Although here there was slightly more stuttering, with the 0.1% low being at 24.5 FPS. Shadow of the Tomb Raider got 129.2 FPS at the highest settings, although we have nothing to compare it to. But this game is very playable and we could even turn on anti-aliasing. Resident Evil 3 at high settings got 229.3 FPS on average. We probably should have turned up the settings even higher here, but there were loads of warnings about not having enough video memory. The RTX 4060 only has 8GB of VRAM, which is not a lot for modern gaming. Like, you can pick up an RX 580 which also has 8GB of VRAM, and that's from like years ago. CS2 at high settings 1080p got us 126.2 FPS on average, and that's good for playing an esports title like Counter-Strike. Onto another esports title, Rainbow Six Siege got 193.4 FPS on low settings, and turning the settings up to ultra we got 172.6 FPS. There was not really any stuttering at all, as shown by the 1% low being at 130.8 and the 0.1% low being at 102.6 FPS. This is very good when playing Rainbow Six Siege, as you want a higher FPS in a competitive game like this. Finally, in 3D Mark Time Spy, our overall score increased from 1,523 to 9,969, and that's a huge jump in performance. Our graphics score went from 1,340 to 10,608. So it really shows how much extra performance we can get from adding in our graphics card, even if it's limited to PCIe 4.0 X4. Overall, the MinisForum UN1250 is very good for the price. The ability to add an eGPU and get great performance in games is a definite bonus. I can see why this would be useful, as you can take the PC when you go somewhere, as it's very portable, and then you can connect it to any display or TV. When you want to play games at your house, let's say, then you can easily connect it to an eGPU and get very good FPS, or you can even play less demanding titles straight from the PC itself. For general everyday web browsing and document writing, the PC has more than enough power, and the fact that you can pretty much hide it makes it very good in setups with limited space. Thanks for watching.